follow on that in particular. Have the Qataris given any indication that they're any more reluctant to deal with Hamas now that Sinwar is de facto at the head of the organization?
No, they have not. In fact, Qatar has indicated to us that they continue to look to play the productive role they have really played since October 7th. Qatar, along with Egypt, have played an incredibly important role in trying to mediate a ceasefire deal. They played a role in the return of hostages previously. And they continue to play a really important role that you see us often express gratitude for, and that continues to be the case.
Absent the designation by Hamas, presumably by Sinwar, of somebody who can physically be present at these negotiations, because presumably Sinwar himself will not be traveling to Cairo or anywhere else.
Presumably correct, yeah.
Is there not at least a logistical obstacle to furthering ceasefire talks at this time?
So a few things about that. Number one, Hanea was not the only person who attended talks when there have been previous rounds of negotiations. There are other people from Hamas, from outside Gaza, who attended those talks, and that can still be the case. Those people have had the ability to get messages to Sinwar. That's been true all throughout the negotiations, and I would expect that to still be the case. The second thing is that just because, or let me say it a different way. Second thing is that actual physical negotiations are not the only time that there are talks that go on throughout this process, right? We talk to Qatar and Egypt all the time. We talk to Israel all the time. They have the messages to communicate with the leadership of Hamas, even absent getting in a room and talking to them. And I would expect that to continue to be the case as well.
I do not mean this to sound flippant, but does it not require, and I take your latter point, but does it not require a commitment from Israel and I guess all of the negotiating parties not to kill the people who are taking part in these talks, if only to, again, sort of finalize a deal that I assume would have to happen in person?
So we want to see the talks get finalized, right? There's a couple ways to take your question. If you mean with respect to Sinwar, maybe that's not what you meant. So I just say, because that was something that Sean asked about. Certainly with respect to Sinwar, is something that somebody that we believe ought to be brought to justice. There are other members of Hamas as well who are terrorists who deserve to be brought to justice in one way or the other. But we do want to get these talks across the finish line. It is important that the talks be able to take place, that they take place sometimes virtually, and that they take place in person as well. And we're going to continue to push for those to happen to finalize this agreement. As you've heard the president say, as you've heard the secretary say, we really do think we are in the final stages. We have agreement on a framework. There's some final pieces left to agree on to implementation. That takes both Israel and Hamas agreeing. So yes, we want to see talks continue, and that does mean that there has to be someone on the other end of those negotiations.
I guess I more mean who would want this job, given it probably places an immediate target on this person's back.
So I'm not sure that I fully accept the premise of the question. I would hope people would want but I would just say, well, there are a number of people who've been involved in the negotiations. I would just say, I would hope people would want the job because they would see getting a ceasefire deal in the interest of the Palestinian people that they purport to represent. That, I think, is a reason why anybody who is a member of Hamas or a leader of Hamas ought to want to participate in these negotiations, get them over the finish line.
Okay, and on the final stages qualification, which seems like it's a relatively recent descriptor that the White House and the State Department have been using to describe these talks. Not too long ago, a U.S. official said that there were still implementation issues that needed to be overcome. Is this description of final stages meant to indicate that those implementation issues have been resolved, or are they still outstanding?
There are still implementation issues that need to be resolved, but if you look at how far we have come and what's left remaining, those implementation issues, maybe minor is not the right word, but compared to the scope of what has been agreed to, are things that we think ought to be able to agree to, and ought to be able to be agreed to fairly quickly by the two parties. And so we do not think there should be any further delay. We think both parties ought to come to an agreement, and that is the message that we have sent directly, as well as what you've heard us say publicly.
One quick last one on al-Assad and whether there's been any engagement diplomatically with the Iraqi government as to, is there any indication the Iraqi government is going to take any steps to investigate, to mitigate what happened to U.S. troops?
Yeah, so we have been in conversation with the Iraqi government about this question. You may have seen also they have announced publicly that they've launched an investigation and arrested a number of suspects in connection with the attack. That, of course, is the appropriate thing for them to do. We have long said in previous rounds of attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq, that those personnel are there at the invitation of the Iraqi government, and it is incumbent upon the Iraqi government to take steps to prevent attacks in the first place. And when attacks do occur, to fully investigate and hold accountable those parties responsible. So it's appropriate that they are doing so in this case.
Another on Russia.
Yeah, you already said last one. So
I know, exactly. Yeah, no, I know.
Just to follow up on the negotiations,